Hello, my name is Rafe Poisson and welcome to my channel. This is the second part of a video around racism. In the first video I made, I gave some examples from my life on stories, anecdotes, experiences which I think shaped the way in which I think about race, the way in which I view racism. And in this video I'd now like to continue from that line of thinking using the context that I had throughout my life of racism to now think about modern racism, to reflect about what I see happening in the world today with modern narratives around race and racism. So just as a baseline, I'd like to look at the definition of racism. So according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, there are a few different possible definitions. So the first is a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capabilities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So another way of saying this is that there is something about belonging to a race which allows us to assume that one race is better than another, because if you belong to a race, you have certain characteristics which make you either better or worse than other races. The second definition, the systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. So I think this is what people refer to now as systemic racism. And then the third is a political or social system founded on racism and designed to execute its principles. So similar to the second definition. So the first seems to be more personal, and then definitions 2 and 3, this is referring, I think, to systemic racism. Now, while these types of racism certainly exist and are valid, the terms racism and racist are being increasingly misused, at least in my opinion. In some situations, it seems that the word has been almost weaponized and used in a variety of different attacks. So I think most commonly in ad hominem attacks, just disregarding somebody's views or opinion by using this ad hominem attack, you're racist. In other situations, it seems that this term racism has been appropriated by identity politics and ideologues, where we get new concepts such as white fragility and white privilege, which seem to be relatively new concepts. Then systemic or institutional racism is similarly misused when representing statistics and interpreting statistics rather, such as assuming that inequality between racial composition of a national population and incarceration, so looking at what is the percent of this race in a population and what is the percent of that race in prison. Thinking about it in terms of race, and inferring that this is a result or proof of systemic racism, rather than realizing that there are many contributing factors, such as the simple fact that violent crime is committed more by certain segments of the population rather than others. It's very similar to other single variant explanations of complex things. So, for example, the gender wage gap. Looking at it only in terms of gender rather than the multitude of other variables gives a very skewed interpretation of what's really going on. It also seems to me that the term racism has become so heavily politicized that it may now only be used in very, very specific contexts. We have statements such as by Marley Kay, which you see here, that all white people are racist, which ironically is a deeply racist statement to make, When thinking about it in terms of the first definition, a belief that race is fundamental determinant of human traits and capabilities, that racial differences produce inherent superiority of particular race. So she's identifying people in a race that she's calling whites, so people that are white, and she's making the assumption that all people that are white are racist, thus inferior to non-whites, which are, I imagine, by her definition, not racist, um, by by virtue of their race. And so I find that statement fits with the definition of racism, and it's ironic, and I wish I could laugh at it, but um, I think it's quite toxic, to be honest. Um, and it's not so here, because she's criticizing the whites. It's politically correct from from our modern political correctness. But I wonder, in the future, will this be future proof? So I wonder if in the future, if we as a society, looking back at this kind of statement, which is politically correct today, will it still be politically correct in the future, or will we look at this and think, wow, that's terribly racist, and there might be backlash to her? And I think it's important to think about, are we on the right side of history? Because if we're basing our actions on what's politically correct today, that's dangerous, I think, because political correctness, it's a fickle beast. So today, saying one thing might be the correct thing to say, tomorrow it might not be. And so in the future, this lady, Marley Kay, might be seen as just as bigoted as the apparent whites she dislikes so strongly today. I'd also like to note that what might appear to be racism is not always about race. So certainly there are people who commit horrific acts purely based on a person's race, but my personal experience is that it's more commonly about culture rather than race. So for example, there's no mental barrier to identifying with people of any race or origin, but that has the same culture as you, that speaks your language, that went to the same school as you, and has all the same cultural references. Compare that to someone who's from vastly different social and linguistic background. And I think when you're able to strongly identify with somebody, versus not being able to identify, I think the resulting behavior can appear to be racial, whereas I think it's more cultural. I think so. If I think of a personal experience, I have a black friend who grew up in London, and when I'm with him, I feel absolutely no different than being around a white friend. We're so similar culturally that it's just a non-issue. Um, I but And then I also have a black colleague whose parents are from Nigeria but who grew up in England. And similarly, interacting with him in business meetings subjectively feels no different from any other colleague. However, I was also friends with a family from Nigeria, um, who had only just recently relocated to France. And here, interactions with them were always a little bit uncomfortable for me. The way they express themselves, the social protocols, their worldview, even their cuisine, it's so different to my own that it, it's it's difficult sometimes to identify with them, to understand them culturally. Um, a corollary example would be a Ukrainian friend of mine who grew up in the States, and our interactions are very smooth and comfortable because of how similar our cultures are. And both her and I can easily identify with the perspectives and worldviews of the other. However, then I've got another friend, and his wife is from the Ukraine, but with a much stronger cultural influence. And with her, I find it quite difficult to understand her worldview, her mannerisms, or even how she reasons on some topics. And I, I suspect that it's the ignorance or the lack of appreciation for different cultures which might be more of a common source of what appears to be racism than actual dislike or discrimination of that race. So we've discussed the use of the term racism, but I'd like to step back and think about what race is. It's interesting to look at the Wikipedia entry for race, and this highlights how arbitrary this label is, um, and that race is just a system of classification of humans, but it's quite arbitrary. So it was first used to categorize humans based on language, then by nationality, and then later by physical traits or phenotypes. Um, and now in modern times, it's regarded as purely a social construct based on rules of classification that's agreed on by society. So for example, if you today we might talk about a black person, but that black person, they might come from Jamaica, or they might come from Senegal or from South Africa, or it's quite arbitrary. It's very bizarre to just lump everyone that has a similar skin tone into something called the black race. So these modern constructs are completely disconnected from object reality. So for example, I'm classified as white or Caucasian. However, I'm technically African. I was born in South Africa. My parents were born in South Africa. My grandparents are South African. Um, but I also have an Aboriginal ancestor on my father's side of the family from Australia, and therefore I'm not pure white. um, so what am I? As mentioned earlier, the vast majority of my friends in France don't come from purely French lineage. And so as the world becomes more globalized, as immigration becomes easier, it's only logical that populations will become more and more mixed and homogenized. Um, and this is really quite desirable, because research shows that the higher the genetic diversity, such as mixed race children, this results in improved cognition, ability, and improved health. And so it's a really good thing to have this big mixture of of genetic material, essentially. But I just want to reiterate that this idea of race, it doesn't exist. There's no such thing as race in the way that we use it. It's completely decoupled from objective reality. It's completely a construct, a mental construct, social construct. And if you asked someone to define a specific race, I think you would find either they can't really do it, or at least they can't do it technically, um, or there would be huge logical flaws in their reasoning. One very inconvenient part of our biology is what's referred to as the behavioral immune system. So this is a deep biological instinct which triggers a disgust reaction in response to perceived pathogens. So that means, in other words, when we observe something in the world around us, and we make an association to foreign substance or a danger of disease, it triggers something inside of us which produces the disgust response. And this appears to be a defense mechanism to mitigate to some extent the risk of coming into contact with foods, animals, or even other humans, which pose a threat of contaminating and making us sick. Here you see this research article I got a screenshot of. And this is a 2020 article by O'Shea, Watson, and Brown, in which they point out that the behavioral immune system results in in-group out-group dynamics. In-group out-group dynamics, where what they call otherness is avoided, which means people that don't look like you or that you don't identify with. These others are avoided, or just this concept of otherness, something that's different, is avoided as part of risk lowering defense mechanisms. So this includes feeling negatively towards those with different accents or from people that are from different regions to us. And this idea is that we've been programmed biologically. So it's not something that's socially constructed. It's really part of our biology to avoid those who might have been exposed to different types of pathogens. So imagine somebody is from very, very far away. The types of disease that they might be exposed to are very different to the types of disease here. And so if somebody comes up to us and they look very, very different, the reasoning, the sort of evolutionary biology reasoning, is that we've developed this as a protection, because if they look very different, they're probably from a different part of the world, and so they might be bringing with them diseases which we're not immune to, and so we have this disgust instinct. We want to avoid them, get away from them, to protect ourselves, and this is all happening unconsciously. And so the argument is that this could be a biological basis, or at least a contribution towards racial discrimination. And so if this is true, it would seem that the remedy would be to reduce the perception of otherness through early exposure to multiple cultures and heritages. So if we do that, then we're able to normalize diversity, and so then minimize this out-group response dynamic. And I really think that this is the key to solve a lot of our problems. So whether or not this theory of the behavioral immune system is correct or true or accurate, which the research suggests it is, whether or not it's real, I still believe that we're able to normalize a lot of the diversity which people seem to be ignorant or at least unaccustomed to, and thus causing a lot of the problems that we have today. Now, when it comes to this kind of inherited guilt, not only do us whites in South Africa need to deal with the past transgressions of the apartheid regime, but we're also universally blamed for slavery. The victims being the people of African descent, which us whites are let's say, the perpetrators of this violence towards them. And actually, just this morning, I was watching an interview by Jordan Peterson, and in that interview, they were talking again about the discussion was around stimulating economic progress in Africa, and obviously the topic of colonization came up, but also slavery, and again it was that the Europeans enslaved the Africans, and this is a common narrative, that us whites enslaved the black people, and I feel it's problematic, and technically yes, there were Europeans that did have black slaves from Africa, but I think it's very misleading to put it like this. I think it's largely a result of the civil rights movement in the United States from the 1940s, where African Americans and others protested racial discrimination, which of course they should have. Racial discrimination is deeply problematic. But the focus was exclusively on the results of the transatlantic slave trade, which started in the 1560s and lasted until the 1830s. And so there's this image of the evil white Europeans capturing the Africans to bring over to the Americas, inventing slavery. But if we really look at the historical context, the, this separation of the victims and villains becomes much blurrier and less defined. Just an interesting point. So, in the Abrahamic tradition, so Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the ancient Israelites were allowed by Mosaic law to engage in slave trade. So there's um, Leviticus chapter 25, which is part of the Mosaic law. It lays out the details for buying, selling, and owning slaves. And so this was completely accepted in these religious traditions. And this was thousands of years ago. Now, prior to the transatlantic slave trade, there were well-established slave routes around Africa for centuries before any European ship landed on African shores. And in fact, as far back as we're able to look in terms of human history, there have been slaves. Um, so, yeah, yeah. So during this transatlantic slave trade, um, there were about 12 million slaves that were transported by ship from Africa to America. Interestingly, today, in 2022, there are over 40 million slaves around the world. So 12 million slaves, transatlantic slave trade, 40 million slaves today around the world. That's 4 times as many slaves that were taken from Africa to America. So that's not to excuse the slave trade. It's just to the transatlantic slave trade. It's just to give some perspective to show that transatlantic slave trade, taking those 12 million Africans from Africa to America, firstly, it's just a drop in the bucket, not only in recent history, but across all time. Secondly, it wasn't a new invention. There were slaves in Africa for centuries before Europeans, and so it's not that these evil Europeans invented slavery, capturing these poor free people in Africa and making them slaves, but actually they were just participating in this tradition of slavery which has existed for as long as human beings have been alive. It seems a natural part of the human condition to dominate one another, and in extreme ways, it seems. So, whilst again, I'm not saying that slavery did not exist between the Europeans or the Americans even and Africans, but what I am saying is that it's not as simple to say that white people enslaved black people. Black people enslaved some whites. There were there were Middle Easterners that enslaved blacks that enslaved Middle Easterners. There were huge amounts of slavery across the world, in fact, and this is not a European invention. And so, when I discovered this, it made me very frustrated because I had this terrible feeling since I was a child of guilt for being white, for people that looked like me in the past, treating people that didn't look like me very badly. Now I realize that there's no reason to feel guilt. Firstly, because I have not done anything. It's just people that happen to look like me and have some kind of genetic similarity to me that did these bad things. But secondly, not only did they do bad things, but everyone else was doing bad things as well. And actually, it wasn't considered bad. It was just a normal part of life back then. And so I think it's problematic to use the modern lens of political correctness and modern morality and ethics to judge past societies. so between African tribes there was warfare, there was discrimination, there was um, so I mean not exclusively. So in Africa, a lot of tribes they intermarried to try and establish diplomatic relationships and to collaborate to try and have peace. But there was also war between African tribes. At school, we studied African history and specifically Zulu history because I grew up in the region of the Zulu people, KwaZulu Natal, and um, the, we studied King Shaka, who was a great king of the Zulus, who was also um, um, well known and famous for his military prowess, um, and many other historical African figures were great warriors because there was lots of warfare between the different African tribes, um, and so it's not that there was this um, romantic idea of innocent savages in the wild, which the Westerners took advantage of. There was uh, rich um, rich culture that had its pros and cons, like any other culture, and had slavery already existing, which then the Europeans took advantage of. So today I see things very differently, and I think it's important to acknowledge this, not to excuse what happened, but rather to alleviate unnecessary guilt. And I think at some point we just have to move on. We can't, if we're going to go around blaming people's ancestors, blaming people for everything their ancestors did, we might as well all be in prison because at some point in time, everyone's ancestors committed some kind of crime by today's standards, and I think that's important. By today's standards, it's wrong, it's incorrect, but we live in a very different world um, to our ancestors, and and we're very quick to forget that and to not consider and to be quite um, bigoted in judging the past. Imagine, as a small thought experiment, imagine that you're a teacher in a primary school class and you have a problem in your class where your students keep using foul language and shouting out swear words. So you make it very clear that you don't tolerate that kind of language in your class. Would you then think it's appropriate when the children then swear to retaliate and shout back swear words at the children? Would you swear back at them as a form of retaliation? So I think that's obviously ridiculous. If you're saying that you don't tolerate swearing in your class and you swear in response to their swearing, it's inconsistent. It's hypocritical, in fact. Now, in modern times, Western societies have made it clear that racism is not to be tolerated and that racism of the past now faces retaliation with more racism in the form of affirmative action, which is the same logic as in our little thought experiment. Correcting discrimination of one group through the discrimination of another does not eliminate discrimination. It just transforms it from one form of discrimination to another form of discrimination. And the toxicity of the past just evolves into newer and more insidious forms of social poisons. And we're now sending our children into this new stew of maladaptive guilt, incoherence, and decontextualized narratives. And I have two small children, and I really hope that they never have to feel the same kind of toxic guilt and shame for for things that were done decades ago by people that they never knew and and who did things which they would never do, um, being them in today's world. I really believe in justice, but I believe that people should be held responsible for what they do, not what their ancestors have done. So, ironically, we have the situation of this self-fulfilling prophecy being created by communities of individuals, specifically those that identify as anti-racist. And I find this to be quite a sick joke in our modern times. So, to protect the continued existence of their group identity as this of the anti-racist, racism has to exist. You can't identify yourself as anti-racist if what you're anti doesn't exist. So it has to exist for you to exist. And so more and more novel forms of racism are invented all the time to be outraged over and to reinforce that group identity of the anti-racist. And so this means that racism is perpetuated by the very group which is supposedly fighting against it. And this needs to be the case for group identity to survive. As if racism disappeared, what would happen to the group of anti-racists? So again, focusing on interpreting the world through a racist lens, no matter if you want to call it racism, anti-racism, affirmative action, black economic empowerment, or anything else, will always result in perpetuating racism in one form or another. And so the anti-racists argue that we should not ask if racism exists or if it's occurred in a given situation or context or event, but rather how has it occurred, always assuming that racism is pervasively present and so teasing it out through a kind of woke astrological reading of bones and omens, to be a bit facetious. But it's really like that. It's really like they're looking constantly for signs and omens and of the racism of how is this racist? Never questioning, did racism occur or is it racist? And this really strange phenomenon, unfortunately, it's not limited to racism and the anti-racist movement. It's part of this broader issue brought about by intersectionality, where ever more fine-grained identity segments are being extruded from us as humans. And new groups and new group identities are constantly being formed. And in my opinion, as long as intersectionality is running rampant and allowed to exist, we will be greatly exacerbating the issue of discrimination along all these dimensions that are being created, rather than working to stamping it out. If we do not stop this, these problems which these groups are protesting to fight against will only get worse, in my opinion. So, how do we move forward? What is the solution? So, I don't know what the solution is. I only have some thoughts. I only have some assumptions. I only have some hopes and wishes. But what I think is that rather than affirmative action, I hope that we're able to move government policy rather towards assisting the dispossessed, the poor, the needy, by identifying the people that need help rather than by identifying racial groups or gender groups. And I'm sure there must be metrics which can be used to determine who needs help without first asking what is the color of their skin. If we want to stop racism, if we need to stop framing everything in terms of racism. A racial lens does still have a place in society, obviously. So, for example, in the field of epidemiology, it's often important to note the differences in disease expression and prevalence across racial groups. But that's very specific. in the vast majority of day-to-day situations, these categorizations of race have no utility. And as we've already discussed, it doesn't even mean anything. There's no such thing as race. It's a completely um, constructed notion. Um, and so that's one thing. And then I think another important thing to consider is the education of our children. I think we need to remove this element of otherness or the unknown. We need to celebrate culture. We need to celebrate variety, um, diversity, nationalities. And by diversity, I don't mean the woke diversity, which really means only people that agree with me, but I really mean diversity in its original meaning of great variety. And if we're able to elevate education in general, I think many misconceptions would be reduced, many flaws of logic would be avoided, much ignorance would be combated, and civility would become more commonplace rather than this rather uncivilized aggression based on social constructs, which really makes no sense. And I think we we've certainly made a lot of progress in the last century, but we still have some way to go. I just I just hope people realize at some point that some of the progress that we've made is not really progress, but we've just achieved transforming discrimination from one form into another. I also hope that one day we'll be able to realize the dream of Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." I also have 2 children, and I I have a dream that they will not be seen as whites, they will not be seen as Europeans that are associated with slave trade and racism. I hope that my children will not be thought of only in terms of their gender, only in terms of their race, but they will be looked at for who they are as people. They will be looked at for what they are contributing to society, looked at based on their skills, their abilities, their attitudes. But I feel that this is not the world in which we live in today. I feel that we can get there, but there is still some work that we need to do to get there. So thank you for watching my video. Again, these are just my personal opinions and thoughts. I hope I didn't offend anyone. If you agree with, if you disagree rather with anything I said, I'd be very happy to have a discussion in a calm manner in the comments. So please do leave your thoughts, and hopefully we can discuss this further.